Sergeant Marcus Thorne had been stationed with the Kyrathi Empire for exactly 3 months, and he was reasonably sure he still didn't understand half of what happened in their culture on a daily basis. But he was trying, which according to his commanding officer was the point of the military exchange program. The Kyrathi were an old species, their civilization measured in millennia, their traditions built on layers of cultural complexity that made human diplomatic protocols look like kindergarten social rules. They were tall, elegant, with those distinctive elongated ears that could supposedly detect emotional frequencies, and skin that shifted through subtle colors based on mood and status. Queen Velithara had ruled for over 300 years, which was apparently middle-aged by Kyrathi standards. The Unity celebration was one of the Empire's most important ceremonies, an annual event where the Queen renewed her covenant with the people through elaborate ritual that Marcus barely understood despite the briefing materials. The ceremonial plaza was packed. Thousands of Kyrathi citizens in formal attire, their skin colors creating a shifting pattern of cultural significance Marcus couldn't fully read. Diplomatic delegations from dozens of allied species. And at the center of it all, the ceremonial platform where Queen Velithara would perform the blessing ritual. Marcus stood with his unit at the perimeter, 6 human soldiers in dress uniforms, present mostly for symbolic reasons. The actual security was handled by the Kyrathi Royal Guard, elite warriors in ornate armor who'd been training for this role since childhood. "Remember," Lieutenant Dawson had briefed them, "we're here to look professional and represent Earth-Kyrathi cooperation. The guards handle real security. We handle standing still and not embarrassing our species." Marcus was good at standing still. He'd done it at enough ceremonies to have it down to an art form. So he stood at his post, watched the pageantry, and tried to follow what was happening on the platform where the Queen was beginning the ritual sequence. That's when the fire started, not part of the ceremony, not controlled flame in ceremonial braziers. Actual fire, spreading with unnatural speed through the decorative structures that surrounded the plaza like a frame. Marcus's combat instincts kicked in before his conscious brain processed what was happening. Fire spread wrong, too fast, too hot, through materials that should have been flame-resistant. Someone had done something to make this happen. Sabotage, his tactical mind supplied, chemical accelerant, deliberate attack. The crowd noticed within seconds. The orderly ceremony dissolved into chaos as thousands of Kyrathi citizens began fleeing in every direction, survival instinct overriding the cultural conditioning that normally kept them in precise formation. The royal guards moved immediately, textbook response, forming protective barrier around Queen Velithara on her platform. Their training was flawless, for about 15 seconds. Then the fire reached the support structures of the ceremonial platform itself. The decorated columns that held up the Queen's raised position began to burn, the flames eating through materials that definitely shouldn't have been that flammable. The entire edifice started to collapse, and the royal guards broke, not all at once, not in obvious panic, but guard by guard, individual survival calculations resolving in favor of retreat. The first guard pulled back when flames cut off his approach to the platform, tactical repositioning that became full withdrawal. The second followed when burning debris nearly crushed him. The third turned and ran when the ground beneath his feet started buckling from heat. Within 30 seconds, the entire protective formation had dissolved. Elite warriors who trained their entire lives to protect the Queen were running for their lives along with everyone else. Marcus watched it happen from his position 40 meters away. Lieutenant Dawson was shouting orders, something about evacuation protocols, securing the diplomatic delegations, falling back to rally points. Smart, logical, the kind of thinking that kept people alive in crisis situations. But Queen Velithara was still on that platform, surrounded by fire on 3 sides and collapsing structure on the 4th, standing frozen with the kind of shock that comes from watching your elite protectors abandon you to burn. Marcus's brain went into the hyperclarity mode that sometimes happened in combat. Time didn't slow down. That was bullshit. But his perception sharpened, cataloging details with mechanical precision. The Queen was 40 meters away across terrain that was rapidly becoming impassable. The fire was spreading in a pattern that would consume the platform within 2 minutes, maybe less. The royal guards were gone, not just retreating but fully scattered into the panicking crowd. The emergency response teams hadn't arrived yet, and there was no one, literally no one, between the threat and the Queen. Marcus made his decision. Not a tactical decision, not a smart decision, definitely not a survivable decision. Just the only decision he could make and still be able to look at himself afterward. He planted his rifle against the perimeter wall, useless weight for what he was about to do, and started walking toward the fire. "Thorne, where the hell are you going?" Lieutenant Dawson's voice carried over the chaos. Marcus didn't answer. Didn't have time to explain. Just kept walking with deliberate, measured steps toward the burning platform where Queen Velithara stood alone. The heat hit him when he was still 20 meters away. His dress uniform, designed for looking good at ceremonies, not for fire resistance, started smoking. The exposed skin on his face and hands felt like it was sunburning in real time. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run, to save himself, because walking into fire with no plan and no equipment was objectively insane. He kept walking. Marcus reached the base of the platform, as close as he could get before the flames made further approach physically impossible. The heat was intense enough that his vision was blurring from tears his eyes were producing to protect themselves. His uniform was definitely on fire in places. His lungs were protesting even through the emergency filter mask he'd pulled up over his nose and mouth. He could see Queen Velithara clearly now, maybe 10 meters above him on what remained of the platform. Her ceremonial robes were smoking. Her skin had gone pale white, shock or fear or some Kyrathi emotion Marcus didn't know. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Marcus planted his feet, set his stance the way Sergeant Instructor Hayes had drilled into him back at basic. Weight distributed evenly, center of gravity low, position that communicated absolute stability. A stance that said, "I am not moving from this spot." He positioned himself directly between the worst of the fire and the Queen's platform. Facing the flames, not looking back at her, not shouting, not announcing what he was doing, just standing there. A human shield against fire that didn't care about shields. The heat was unbearable. Marcus could feel his skin blistering on his face and hands, anywhere not covered by his uniform. The smoke was overwhelming his filter mask, toxic chemicals making his eyes water and his throat close. His brain was screaming damage reports, second-degree burns forming, smoke inhalation reaching dangerous levels, heat exhaustion imminent. He was going to die here. The certainty settled over him like a familiar weight. He'd been in combat situations before where death seemed likely. This was different. This was knowing with absolute conviction that he would not walk away from this position, but someone needed to be here. Someone needed to stand between the fire and the Queen. And the elite guards who trained their entire lives for this role had run. So it was him, a human sergeant with 3 months of cultural exchange experience and no idea what he was actually supposed to do beyond stand here until the fire killed him. Behind him, he heard Queen Velithara make a sound, not words, but something that carried harmonics his ears could barely process. Shock, maybe, or recognition, or some Kyrathi emotion that had no human equivalent. Marcus didn't turn around, didn't take his eyes off the fire that was going to consume him. If he was going to die, he was going to die doing his job, facing the threat, holding his position. Through the flames and smoke, he saw movement at the edge of the plaza. Emergency response teams finally arriving, Kyrathi in protective gear carrying equipment designed specifically for chemical fires. Suppression systems deploying. Foam that could actually smother this kind of accelerant-enhanced fire. The fire's advance slowed. Not stopped. Fire this intense didn't just stop, but the spread rate decreased as the suppression systems took effect. Marcus stayed planted. Didn't retreat even as the emergency teams established perimeter around the fire zone. Didn't move even as the flames began to be contained. His position was between the threat and the Queen. The threat wasn't neutralized yet, so he stood. His legs were shaking now, not from fear, but from the physical stress of maintaining position while his body was being systematically damaged by heat and smoke. His vision was tunneling, dark spots appearing at the edges. Heat exhaustion his training supplied, possibly early heat stroke. He locked his knees, focused on his breathing, stayed upright through pure stubborn refusal to fall. The emergency teams worked with impressive efficiency. Within 3 minutes of their arrival, the fire was contained. Within 5 minutes, it was extinguished. The platform was a charred ruin, but the structure had held long enough for the teams to deploy rescue equipment and extract Queen Velithara to safety. Marcus watched her being helped down by emergency personnel in protective gear, her ceremonial robes ruined but her person apparently unharmed. Mission accomplished, his tactical brain supplied. Then his legs gave out. He didn't collapse, muscle memory and training prevented total loss of control. But he sank to one knee, then both knees, his body finally registering all the damage it had sustained. Burns, smoke inhalation, heat exhaustion. Probably some internal injuries he wasn't aware of yet because adrenaline was still keeping the pain at manageable levels. Someone was talking to him, medic in protective gear, asking questions in Kyrathi that his translator implant was trying to render but his foggy brain couldn't process. He watched Queen Velithara being escorted away from the plaza toward waiting medical transport. She was looking back at him, her skin cycling through colors he'd never seen in the briefing materials. Then his vision went dark and consciousness became optional. When awareness returned, could have been minutes or hours, he had no sense of time. Marcus was in a medical pod, Kyrathi technology working on his burns with efficiency that human medicine couldn't match. The pain was managed, reduced to tolerable levels by whatever they were injecting. What wasn't managed was the crowd. Queen Velithara was there, standing at the edge of the medical pod. So were at least 30 Kyrathi in formal attire, military commanders, government officials, nobles whose ornate clothing suggested high rank, all of them staring at him. "Sergeant Thorne," the Queen said, her voice carrying those harmonics that made his medical equipment spike, "you have performed Kel'vethara. Do you understand what this means?" Marcus's throat was raw from smoke. "No, Your Majesty. I stood my post, that's all I know." The assembled Kyrathi made sounds, shock or surprise or something his translator couldn't quite capture. "You did far more than stand your post," Queen Velithara said, her skin shifting through complex colors. "You have invoked ancient law. You have bound yourself to me through the oldest and most sacred covenant in Kyrathi culture." Marcus's foggy brain struggled to process this. "Your Majesty, you were in danger. Someone needed to. Someone needed to stand," the Queen interrupted gently. "And when my elite guards fled, when everyone else ran for their lives, you, a human soldier with 3 months of cultural training, a Kyrathi military commander stepped forward, elderly male whose ears bore so many decorations Marcus couldn't count them all. His skin was solemn purple as he spoke. "In Kyrathi culture, we have a concept called Kel'vethara, the binding stand. It is ancient law, predating our current empire, rooted in the warrior codes that built our civilization. When someone plants themselves as shield between threat and protected, when they choose certain death over retreat, when they stand without weapon or hope of survival but with absolute resolve, they invoke sacred bond." He gestured to Marcus. "What you did, Sergeant Thorne, was textbook Kel'vethara. You positioned yourself between the Queen and mortal danger. You held that position despite being unable to actually stop the threat. You chose duty over survival. This is binding act that cannot be undone. I don't understand, Marcus said, his brain still foggy. I just couldn't leave her there. Someone had to stand. That, Queen Velithara said, is exactly what makes it binding. You did not perform Kel'vethara for recognition or reward. You did it because standing seemed like the only option you could live with. That purity of intent makes the bond absolute. Another official, female with elaborate robes suggesting government position, spoke up. The royal guards who fled have been stripped of their positions. They broke formation and abandoned their sacred duty, while a foreign soldier with minimal cultural knowledge stood his ground. The shame will mark their families for generations. Marcus tried to process this. They made a survival choice. The fire was deadly, the commander interrupted. No one disputes this. Running was logical. Running was reasonable. But they were royal guards, trained from childhood to protect the queen even at cost of their own lives. When tested, they failed. When tested, you who had no such training, no cultural obligation, no reason beyond basic decency succeeded. I didn't succeed, Marcus protested. I just stood there. The emergency team stopped the fire, not me. You held position until the emergency teams arrived, Queen Velithara corrected. You bought me the minutes I needed to survive, and you did it knowing you would not survive yourself. That is Kel'vethara in its purest form. She turned to address the assembled officials. By ancient law, Sergeant Thorne is no longer foreign soldier. He is Kel'veth, my bonded protector. This supersedes all other military assignments and diplomatic protocols. He is now under my direct authority and protection. The officials murmured. Skin colors shifting through variations Marcus couldn't interpret, but that clearly indicated this was significant. Over the following days, as Marcus recovered in the medical facility, he learned what being Kel'veth actually meant. He was no longer part of the human military exchange program. That assignment had been terminated the moment he invoked Kel'vethara. He now served directly under Queen Velithara's authority, a position that outranked the entire royal guard. The guards who had fled faced tribunals. Some were exiled. Some were stripped of rank and reassigned to positions where courage under fire wasn't required. All carried dishonor that would affect their families for generations, not because fleeing fire was unreasonable, but because they had fled while someone else stood. A Kyrathi cultural liaison, elderly female named Sithara, who'd been assigned to explain everything to Marcus in terms a human could understand, visited him regularly. You created a cultural crisis, she told him bluntly. The royal guards are supposed to be the empire's finest warriors. They are trained from childhood. They are honored above all others, and they broke while a human with 3 months of exposure to our culture stood firm. Do you understand how that looks? I understand it makes them look bad, Marcus said. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean anything, Sithara interrupted, her skin patient blue. You simply acted on instinct. But your instinct revealed something about our guards that we did not want to see. That all their training, all their cultural conditioning, all their supposed dedication to duty, it failed when truly tested. They're not cowards, Marcus protested. The fire was spreading too fast, the structure was collapsing. No one calls them cowards, Sithara said. We call them failed. There is difference. Cowardice is lack of courage. Failure is having courage but not enough. They were brave enough for normal danger, not brave enough for certain death. You were. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I didn't feel brave, I felt inevitable. Like there was only one choice, and I was just following it. That, Sithara replied, is what Kel'vethara means. Not the decision to be heroic, but the inability to choose anything other than standing, regardless of outcome. You could not make yourself run even when running was logical. That is the mark of true Kel'veth. Queen Velithara visited him privately, when he'd recovered enough to sit up without assistance. Sergeant Thorne, she said, settling into a chair that seemed to grow from the floor, I owe you my life, but I also owe you explanation. Do you understand what you have bound yourself to? Not really, Your Majesty. Kel'vethara creates permanent bond. You are now my protector in ways that transcend normal guard duty. Where I go, you go. What threatens me, you face. This is not assignment you can resign from. This is identity you have claimed through your actions. Marcus absorbed this, so I'm stuck. You are bonded, the Queen corrected. Whether you view this as constraint or honor is your choice. But yes, you cannot leave my service without violating sacred law that would bring dishonor to both of us. I didn't know that when I stood. I know, that is what makes the bond pure. You stood not for reward or recognition. You stood because standing seemed right. That truth is witnessed and honored. The Queen's skin shifted to contemplative purple. When you planted your feet between me and the fire, what were you thinking? Marcus considered the question honestly. I was thinking that if I didn't stand, I'd have to live knowing I could have. And that seemed worse than dying. 6 months later, Marcus stood at his new post outside the Queen's private chambers. He'd fully recovered from his burns, though he carried scars that Kyrathi medical technology couldn't completely erase. The scars were honored here, proof of Kel'vethara, evidence that he'd stood when standing meant dying. He was no longer Sergeant Thorne of Earth's military. He was Kyrathi Thorne, bonded protector of Queen Velithara. His uniform was now Kyrathi design, blend of ceremonial and functional that marked him as something unique in the Empire's hierarchy. One of his former unit members visited, Rodriguez, who'd helped evacuate civilians during the fire and had been awarded commendations for his actions. "Strange seeing you in Kyrathi uniform," Rodriguez said, studying Marcus's new attire. "You look like you belong here now." "I'm not sure I do," Marcus admitted, "but apparently I don't have a choice anymore." "Do you regret it, standing when you could have run?" Marcus thought about the fire, the heat, the certainty of death. "I regret not having a way to actually stop the flames. I regret that people got hurt. I regret that the guards who ran now carry dishonor that affects their families and descendants." "But standing—" "No," Marcus said. "I don't regret that. When everything failed and protocols meant nothing and the only choice was what kind of person I wanted to be when I died, I wanted to be someone who stood, even if it was stupid, even if it didn't work. Running was just not an option I could live with." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "They're teaching your stand in military academies now, Earth and Kyrathi both, the human who held position when elite guards fled. You're going to be in training manuals forever." "I know," Marcus said dryly. "It's very strange being famous for not moving." "You didn't not move," Rodriguez corrected. "You became a shield when shields couldn't stop what was coming. You chose who you'd be when you died over who you'd be if you survived. That's not nothing." Through the window, Marcus could see Queen Velithara conducting state business in an adjacent chamber. She was protected now by new guards. The Royal Guard had been completely restructured, retrained with Kel'vethara as the standard they had to meet. "I planted my feet," Marcus said quietly. "The fire didn't care, but she lived. And I can live with being someone who stood. I couldn't live with being someone who didn't." "That's probably why they honor you," Rodriguez observed. "You're not performing Kel'vethara, you just are it. The bond isn't something you claimed. It's something you are." After Rodriguez left, Marcus returned to his post. The Kyrathi court had adapted to his presence. The human Kel'veth was now part of the Empire's fabric, proof that courage and duty transcended species and culture. Queen Velithara emerged from her chambers, preparing for a diplomatic function. She paused when she saw Marcus at his post. "You still have that look," she observed. "Like you're ready to plant your feet and refuse to move at any moment." "Just doing my job, Your Majesty." "No," Velithara corrected gently. "You are being who you are. That is different from doing a job. Jobs can be quit, identity cannot." She studied him for a moment. "Do you regret the bond? The permanence of it?" Marcus considered the question honestly. "I regret that I didn't understand what I was getting into. I regret that my old life ended without me choosing that ending. But the stand itself? No. I'd make the same choice again, even knowing it would bind you permanently. Even then, because the alternative was running while you burned, and I couldn't be someone who made that choice and still look at myself. The queen's skin shifted to warm gold, approval and respect. That is what makes you Kel'veth, not the training, not the culture, just the inability to be anything other than the shield when the shield is needed. As Marcus accompanied the queen to her diplomatic function, his new role requiring him to be present at all state events, he reflected on the strangeness of how one decision had reshaped his entire existence. He'd stood because running seemed impossible, not impossible physically, impossible morally, impossible to reconcile with who he needed to be. The fire had come, the guards had fled, and Marcus Thorne had planted his feet and refused to move, not because he could win, not because standing would work, but because being a shield, even a shield that couldn't stop the flames, was the only choice he could make and still be someone he could live with being. Sometimes courage isn't movement or attack or brilliant tactics. Sometimes courage is just planting your feet and becoming immovable when the world is burning and everyone else is running. Sometimes being the shield is enough, even when the shield can't stop what's coming, even when standing means dying, even when the choice becomes permanent and reshapes everything. Marcus had stood, the fire hadn't cared, the queen had lived, and the stand had mattered. He was Kel'veth now, bonded protector, the one who stands. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd earned by being unable to choose anything other than standing when standing was needed. And that, he decided as he took his position at the diplomatic function, was enough.